All right. So, hey, welcome to our third week, everyone. So, tonight we're going to be talking about different kinds of apologetics, different methods, different ways that people have approached the practice of apologetics. And I got a few things to share. I got a few books to share with you. One of the things I'm going to try to do every week is for every specific week that we're coming out of. So last week we did general revelation and natural theology. I got some books that if you're interested in diving into that subject a little more, I have some books that are specialized just for those subjects. And so I will try to bring you books every week after we have discussed a topic, in case you want to follow up with that subject a little more. So I've got some books. We're going to review very quickly what we did last week. We're going to set the agenda for tonight and see where we're going, and then we're going to get into it. So first, if you will, bow your heads with me, and we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into it. So, Lord God, we thank you that we have a class like this, that we get to study something like this, where we get to use our minds to worship you. We get to use our rational abilities to know you better, to worship you, and then to take your gospel out into the world with those abilities and the way that we think. Lord, I just pray that again, every week we want to pray that we do not get puffed up with knowledge. We all remain humble. We all understand that the more we know, we just, the more we know, we realize how little we actually know. And Lord, we just pray that you would bless this time, help us to learn, bring clarity to us. Spirit, I pray that you would illuminate things for us so that we can see clearly. And I pray that we'd also just be gracious in how we deal with things tonight. We're going to be studying different approaches by different Christians. And we're going to be jumping across theological lines in some sense, and pray that we're just gracious with our thoughts and our questions tonight, that we would give grace to those who may think differently than us. And that's okay, because everything comes together in you, Lord, and we are seeking the truth, and we may never find it this side of heaven. So I just pray that you would help us as best you can and as best as we can in our ability to understand what we're going to learn tonight, and just give us the patience and give us grace for our fellow brothers and sisters, and just help us to love you and to take your gospel forward in everything we do. Pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So I said I had some books for you, and this is something I kind of want to do every week. I may not have too many next week, but I definitely have some this week that I want to show you. So we talked about general revelation and natural theology last week. We talked about how they're related. How general revelation, God reveals himself in his creation, and how that is the raw data that some theologians have used for natural theology. And one of the best books that I have found most helpful is a book. It is titled General Revelation by Bruce Demaris. It's a hardback. I've got an old hardback. But if you're really wanting to learn more about the general revelation, the entire study, all the biblical elements, all the historical theological elements, this book is killer. General Revelation by Bruce Demaris. It's not in print anymore. I think it just recently went out of print. It's a few years old. It was originally published in 1982. It's great. This has been an excellent book. It's very approachable. May get a little heady at times when he's talking about some of the more modern theologians, but definitely when you're talking about the historical theologians, your Augustine, your Aquinas, your Anselm, going up through Luther and Calvin and into the Puritans, very approachable, super helpful, really helps to draw things together and help you understand that. So that's one that I would really, if you're looking to learn more about some of the stuff we talked about last week, General Revelation by Bruce Demaris. If you can find it, it's gold. Again, it's not in print anymore. You got to go find one somewhere out in the interwebs. Another book that has come up recently that some people in the Reformed community are actually talking about is a book called Natural Theology by David Haynes. I believe it was published just last year. Haynes, he is a Reformed Baptist, but he is much broader in his scope of natural theology. He reaches out to sources like Aquinas and Anselm, and he kind of approaches the subject of natural theology, kind of like I did last week, where he says, hey, this is something we can do. We just have to put guardrails around it. And he's really interested in understanding the traditional Reformed definition of natural theology, going back to guys like Luther and Calvin, because he thinks that today that the way that they set out the theology of natural theology back then, he thinks that that's been kind of messed up today, that it's been misinterpreted. So it's a book that was recommended by Kevin DeYoung. So I follow Kevin DeYoung's podcast, and this is one that he recommended. Natural Theology by David Haynes. I have not read it all. I've skimmed it and read parts of it. It's very good. It's a little heady, but if you want something challenging, it's going to be great. It's really going to be a good biblical and historical resource on that topic. And then last one, this isn't quite, this is more condensed with inside natural theology, natural law, by the same author, David Haynes, and his Andrew Fulford, I think, is one of his assistants or his PhD candidates. But these two, they do a philosophical and a theological analysis of what's called natural law. Natural law is kind of like your ethics, so it's a part of general revelation. It's a part of natural theology. It's not the big scope. They're just looking at one small part of it. The philosophy in it is a little tough, but the theology, which is half of the book, is very readable. It's very good. So if you want to take an in-depth look at, how do people understand God's revelation of himself ethically, through creation, this is a great look at that. And, you can only read half of it. I think it's only like $10 on Amazon, and it's only like 120 pages. So really small read. I read it this weekend, so you can move through it pretty quickly. So those are the books, and I'll put these all in our thread, but I want to give you some other resources that you can follow up on that might be helpful if you want to learn more about our subjects that we're pursuing each week. So moving on, just to review last week, actually, let me get rid of this real quick. Put this down here. We talked about our three centers of general revelation, how God reveals himself through his creation, and nature and history and morality, or the spiritual qualities of human beings. We talked about the question, natural theology. Can there be a positive theology built from general revelation? What can be known of God from general revelation? I really, and again, no one has really ever nailed this down, and different people have different opinions and convictions biblically about this. But I kind of land, yeah, there is a natural theology, but we need to keep it in the guardrails and understand that people don't get to salvific knowledge of God through natural theology. And then we talked about the differing perspectives. We talked about Kant, Barth, Aquinas, and Calvin. So if you're totally blanking on this, go back and watch from last week. Move this again. I don't know where I'm going to put this. Maybe up here, yeah. And then we looked at dangerous assumptions of natural theology, that if you don't put those guardrails around natural theology and really try to direct where it goes, there you can run into some dangerous assumptions and believe that it does more than it's capable of. So that's what we did last week. This week, we're going to talk about contemporary approaches to apologetics. Excuse me. So we're going to actually cover really 8 different variations. We're going to talk about rationalism. We're going to talk about evidentialism. We're going to talk about the classical approach, an approach called cumulative case, one called reformed epistemology, another one called presuppositionalism, experiential approach, and then lastly, we're going to talk about fideism. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover. Again, don't take this stuff like you need to remember everything we talk about tonight. My goal in a class like this is to put these names and put these ideas in front of you so that when you encounter them again, when you go off and you do some more learning on your own, you will have encountered these names before. You will be somewhat familiar with these ideas. All right. So I'm not going to quiz you on any of this. Two of these positions I don't even think are necessarily, I don't think they're biblical. So, that's we'll get to that when we cover them. But the six other positions, I think you could hold biblically, and many Christians do. So, and what we'll want to notice right off the bat is that if you look at the descending approaches here, rationalism, evidentialism, classical approach, notice how they go from reason down to faith. Fideism being faith only, that we only do apologetics by faith only. So we kind of have a continuum here going. So we could also put it on a horizontal axis, and you could see it going, horizontally. But just keep that in mind, that up at the top you've got rationalism, which is much more reason based, and then you have all the way at the bottom fideism, which is faith based, completely faith based. And so they're kind of moving. We're going to move from different approaches that highlight reason towards different approaches that highlight faith. So keep that in mind as we're going through these tonight. But let's kick it off right away. And we'll talk about rationalism. This is one of the positions that I don't think is biblical. So I'll just say that right away. Rationalism in apologetics is the approach that God can be known and salvifically comprehended through the use of human reason alone. Now, we talked about this last week when we talked about general revelation and natural theology. We talked about the biblical evidence, and this is just not true. You cannot know God through reason alone. The Bible is very clear about that you need the special revelation of God. No one really practices this anymore, but I want you to be aware of it, okay? Because you will, if you go and read some historical literature on apologetics, they may talk about the school of rationalism. Some of its proponents are, you've probably heard of John Locke, the great political, what would you call him? The political writer, the political philosopher. He was also kind of he was a quasi-Christian, I guess. And, he wrote about ideas of Christianity from a political standpoint. Also, the 18th century deists. If you don't know what a deist is someone who believes in God, that God set up the universe kind of like a watch. He wound it up and then he just let it go on his way. He doesn't intervene into the world after that. He's not providentially in control of that. He doesn't really know what's going to happen. He just winds up the watch and lets it go on its way. That's what a deist would believe. And the 18th century deists, they were very popular in England over there in the 1700s. They really sought to prove God, the existence of God, not just the existence of God, but many Christian doctrines like the Trinity, like the dual nature of Christ, like some of these really difficult things. They tried to prove it just based on reason alone, and they believed that reason alone could deliver us to all of the truths that we hold dearly in the Bible. Needless to say, they didn't last very long. They only lasted about 100 years, and then they fell out of popularity because their system is flawed. But they do have some strengths. They challenge faith only approaches to the knowledge of God. So they would look at someone like a fideist. Someone says, no, we come to God solely on faith alone. We know everything about God by faith alone. There is no cognitive ability within us. There is no reason. They do challenge that, and they say, no, you're missing something, and there is reason here. We can understand some things about God rationally. So that is a strength of theirs. That's the only strength of theirs. There are many weaknesses, though. They deny revealed revelation. So they deny the use of scripture. And that was something that was very clear in John Locke when he wrote. He did not believed that the Bible was the revealed, word of God, that it was a good book and it taught us some good morals, but it was not actually God's word. So that's a huge problem. And that's really kind of why I would consider them outside of Christian orthodoxy. Um, it's questionable. I already talked about this. It's questionable if this approach is even Christian or not. So that is rationalism. And I'm going to do two of these at a time, and I'll stop for questions. So rationalism, just be familiar with it. You may come across it in different apologetics books that you might read in the future, but really, it's not something that we would use today. It's not an approach that's used today in mainstream Christianity. Now, evidentialism is an approach that is used today by many Christians, although it's kind of fallen out of favor in the last century. Evidentialism is the method that seeks to prove apologetic topics by providing opponents with historical evidence. And so, one of the big topics that evidentialists like to cover is the resurrection of Christ. And they believe that if they can prove historically, if they can give enough evidence for the resurrection of Christ, that kind of coerces people into believing in Christianity. It kind of forces people to deal with the miracle of the resurrection. And you know what? They have some great literature out there. I know that at Liberty University, my school, where I'm getting my master's in divinity, the lead research professor there is a man by the name of Gary Habermas. Is it Habermas? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and he is a strict evidentialist. He has his big time. What he is known for is evidence about miracles and are they historically accurate. And, this is his approach. I don't particularly. I'm not interested in the same things that he is interested in, and I don't always agree with him. But there's a lot of good stuff there to take in. Some of the proponents of this, classically, Josh Mcdowell, you may have heard of him. He had the book, The Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and then The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. John Warwick Montgomery, you may have heard of these guys before. They are evidentialists. They believe in giving as much historical data and historical evidence as possible that kind of forces the non-believer into really considering faith and Christianity. And so some strengths, they have great archaeological and historical evidence. I've already said that a little bit. They really know their stuff, and they're well invested in academia, and people have to pay attention to them because they have great evidence. They're involved in broader secular scholarship. So when we talk about archaeology, it's not just people who are digging up things that are, supposedly there from Bible times. They're involved in a broad amount of stuff, and it's not just literature about the Bible, but they are in the universities, they are in academia, and so that's really a good strength to have because they have an influence in a secular institution where people have to pay attention to their findings and to their evidence. One of the weaknesses that they have, and this is a general weakness. I don't know if I can just point out specific apologists that do this all the time, but they kind of assume neutrality on persons who are looking at evidence, that we approach evidence with kind of a neutral bias. We don't really have a bias one way or another, and we can kind of take the evidence objectively, look at it, survey it, and then make a reasonable assessment about that. And I don't find that to be true. You probably don't either. I'm sure you have all dealt with unbelievers before, who are very biased against any kind of notion of faith. And so that I see that as a weakness. I don't believe anybody comes to the table neutrally. I don't believe anybody comes to the table to study things completely objectively. I think there are always underlying assumptions that they bring to the table. And then I think they fall into the trap of needing to provide evidence. And we talked about this in the first week. We don't want to always get into the atheist trap of saying, prove what you believe, because there are many things that people believe about everyday life, for example, your own existence, that is really difficult to prove. It's hard to come up with proofs. Or as an example, I like to tell people all the time, it's like, it is really hard for me to prove that my wife loves me. Now I know she loves me and I can point to all these things, but is that necessarily empirical proof that she loves me? Maybe she's deceiving me. She's not, don't worry. But I know she loves me. I don't need evidence to know that. I know it. And so there are all kinds of things in life that we take for granted, that we understand as basic beliefs that help us really navigate our everyday lives, that we don't need to provide evidence for. And so one of the questions I would pose to an evidentialist is, do you always need to provide evidence for every belief we hold in Christianity? And I would say no, but they may say yes. So those are the first two camps that we want to talk about here. Are there any questions so far? Boom, I'll take that as a no. So, all right. So our next one is the classical approach. I'm trying to move this. Yeah, there we go. The classical approach. Now, this is probably where most people are familiar with apologetics. That if you have ever experienced anything in apologetics, if you've had any kind of introduction to it, it's probably in the classical approach. All right. The classical approach typically consists of providing philosophical reasons for the non-believer to accept the existence of God. All right. They really start with the existence of God, and then they build off of that into other beliefs from that main point of proving God's existence. There's a lot of people that you've probably heard of that use this approach. Thomas Aquinas, we talked about him last week. C.S. Lewis, I know everybody on here has heard of C.S. Lewis. G.K. Chesterton, I'm sure some people have heard of G.K. Chesterton. William Lane Craig, probably the most influential apologist of our time, both intellectually and popularly. William Lane Craig, in my opinion, I can't quantify that, but he's a giant. R.C. Sproul, another, although we kind of think of him more as a pastor theologian type, he definitely wrote apologetics, and he embraced this approach. Now, what's interesting about this approach is that it has a wide theological range to it. We know that Thomas Aquinas is the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. Thomas Aquinas' theology is Roman Catholic theology. We know that C.S. Lewis was an Anglican. G.K. Chesterton at one time was a Protestant. He converted to Catholicism. William Lane Craig is a Baptist, and R.C. Sproul is a Presbyterian. So there's a diverse theological field there of different convictions there that come into this classical approach. And so again, it's probably, if you have any familiarity with apologetics before this class, it's probably with this approach, and maybe someone you've probably read someone on this list before. I know lots of people have read C.S. Lewis. It has some great strengths, excellent philosophical arguments. The five ways, Thomas Aquinas was popular, most noted for coming up with the 5 ways to prove the existence of God. Those ways are still used extensively today. They've been kind of rebranded, rethought, and repackaged, and updated for any kind of challenge that they come up against. But really good stuff. C.S. Lewis, his books they're great sellers. Really, C.S. Lewis's work on miracles, and we will talk about his argument against miracles. It's phenomenal. It does have a few problems, but it's been reworked, and it stood the test of time. And in my opinion, and having studied this at the graduate level, like if we're going to remember C.S. Lewis and apologetics, it's going to be his argument from miracles. That's what's going to make him last in history. Everything else, don't worry. I mean, it's not going to last. I don't think. But his argument on miracles, it's excellent. It's really tough. William Lane Craig is known for what is called the Cosmological argument. We'll talk about the cosmological argument. man, it has stood up for the last 50 years. People are still trying to take it down. And there are many other arguments. We'll get into those, I believe, in week 6, I think. But excellent philosophical arguments. That is definitely a strength of theirs. Another strength is the most popular apologetics material. They take up this method. I've already said this a couple of times. It's a broad theological spectrum. It hits a lot of different Christians, and so it's just this method is very approachable too. You have good writers. I mean, Lewis, Chesterton, and Sproul. You're talking about people that can really reach common Joes like me and you, and just talk to us really well, that some other people that we're going to look at tonight just aren't able to do that. And so it's a great strength that they have, and how they're able to reach out to the laity in the churches. Weaknesses. So one of the weaknesses I pose as a question is, how far can human reason take us? Now, not everybody on this list agrees on how far human reason can go and carry us, and that's one of the big questions they ask. Now, I believe all of the people on this list would agree and say that human reason, we can't have salvific knowledge of God through human reason. Yeah, they would all say that. I know for a fact they would all say that. But they all give different levels of power to human reason. And what that does is, and we talked about this last week, the more power you give to human reason, usually the corresponding effect is that the power of sin on the human person is taken down. And so we talked about in Thomas Aquinas's theology, sin is not as powerful as in like John Calvin's theology. And so that's a huge concern. I'm not saying that defeats their approach or anything, but you have to take it into consideration when looking at different classical apologists. Oh, and that was the only weakness there. So, okay. So, yeah, we're going to look at cumulative case. Most of you probably have never heard of this before. I had never heard of it until I got into my MDiv. I didn't know there was such a thing. Cumulative case apologetics is the method where any argument or method from any Orthodox Christian theological background will be used. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, man. They just do it all. They'll take whatever works, and it's kind of that utilitarian approach. Whatever works, we're going to employ it. The main proponent of this that you can really reach out to and read his books today, Douglas Grutheus. Excellent apologetics book. He has a huge 800-page apologetics introduction to apologetics book. It's only about 10 or 15 years old. It's a great investment if you really want a basic textbook on all kinds of apologetics, and it's approachable, it's readable. It's the first book they make us read in seminary on apologetics. I loved it. I didn't agree with everything he said, but again, it was good stuff. Some strengths: tend to use arguments that work best. They will, I mean, I just said that they'll use whatever works. It's like the Swiss Army knife of apologetic approaches. However, there is a downside to that as well. Weaknesses for them. No, come on. Theological differences are not easily resolved. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, sometimes these different approaches to apologetics are aligned to different theological convictions. And I've mentioned that before. It doesn't always work that way, but like the classical approach that we just spoke about, a lot of times that is reserved for your more Roman Catholic, your high church Anglican, your high church Lutheran, people that give a lot of credence to the use of reasoning in humans gaining knowledge of God. Whereas, what we're going to talk about in a little while, presuppositionalism, is usually more of a reformed approach. Your Baptists or definitely your Presbyterians use it. And so it doesn't always work that way. R.C. Sproul, Presbyterian, he was just on the last slide for the classical approach, but it tends to work that way most of the time. Well, the problem that you run up with in a cumulative case apologetic approach is that sometimes, and philosophers do this, and they're guilty of doing this. Sometimes philosophers just want to answer the problem, and it doesn't always line up with their theological convictions. And so what will happen is they'll give an answer, and I've heard this happen before. I've read it in a book before. John Frame writes about it, about another apologist in one of his books, where the philosopher apologist will give an answer to a philosophical problem against, that atheism raises against belief in God, and he'll answer the question philosophically, but it won't line up with that philosopher's theological convictions. It's just, and so John Frame in his book is like, what's this guy doing? I thought he was a Calvinist, and he's giving me this answer that is not Calvinistic at all. It's the exact opposite. And so that's what I mean by theological differences are not easily resolved. They don't always match up when you are using maybe the best argument possible. There's another side of the sword there where it may not always line up with your theological convictions. And then you've got some real answering to do. You've got some real questions people are going to have about your personal beliefs and how they line up with what you've published in a paper or something like that. So, and then, yeah, weakness could be inconsistent theologically. So that's just another point about that, how they don't always line up. So that was cumulative case and the classical approach. Are there any questions about these other two? We're flying through these.
It's not a question, just a note for, I guess, Will and Krista. Grutheus is, he teaches at Credo House, or did teach some of the courses at Credo House, which is the material we're using for our theology program. And you might notice, as Ben was going through this, you might notice, yeah, sometimes I'm really not clear as they're presenting their material in the theology program, which angle they're taking. And then, and some of us have had conversations about, wait a minute, I thought they believed this, but they just sold that. We stuck with the material because for me, the goal was to get us to think right on our own. But I think then going through this for us in this manner helped us understand how we can see Grutheus' influence in what we're seeing in the theology program. So just a practical example for a couple of you.
Yeah, and most of the time, I mean, I think theologically, 98% of the time, we're going to agree with Grutheus about what he is presenting, but there's just those little things that will throw in problems. But he's actually not a theologian. He's a great philosopher. He teaches out at Denver Seminary, I think. And and he wrote, I know that he wrote the apologetics program on that, the material you guys use, because I remember looking that up.
Credo House, yeah,
Credo House, he wrote the apologetics program on there, so it's good stuff. And I would if you're looking for a good introductory book on apologetics, his book is great. Again, I'm not going to agree with everything he says theologically, and you may not either. But if you want something that's approachable, that's going to cover everything at an introductory level, you can't go wrong with his book. It's excellent. So that was cumulative case. Did anybody else have any questions? All right. Either you guys are just blown away with so much information, or I'm doing a good job. All right, so here's where we're going to get into some fun stuff. This is more of the wacky, or not the wacky stuff, but more of the tough stuff. So Reformed epistemology. Now, before I talk about what Reformed epistemology is, I need to tell you what epistemology is. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy, and it's asking the question, how do we know what we know? It's the philosophical study of knowledge. All right. So Christians do this all the time. We're doing this in this class to an extent where we're talking about, how do we know about God? Do we know about him just through faith? Do we know about him through reason? Do we know about him through evidence? We're asking these questions in this course. We have not used this term very much, but this is a term you need to know. We're going to talk about this a few more times in this class. You need to be familiar with the term epistemology. It is the philosophical study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And Christians have been, they're not all clear on how we, they don't all agree on this subject, and that's okay. We've talked about that. But Reformed epistemology, it's a theory of knowledge primarily developed by a philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga in the later half of the 20th century. And what this is famous for is it's the insistence for proof for the existence of God, which is evidentialism, is irrational. Plantinga came along in about 1968. He wrote a book called, what is it? God and Other Minds. Actually got it right here. God and Other Minds. Don't buy it. I don't understand any of it. It's way over my head. But he wrote a book where he challenged evidentialism. He said, we as Christians and we as Christian philosophers and we as philosophers, we can't always believe that we need to provide evidence for every belief that we hold. We approach everyday life without having evidence for many of our basic beliefs. And I just talked about that, how I believe my wife loves me, but I don't provide evidence for that. I know it. And so there's a lot of things like, I know I ate lunch earlier today. I can't provide evidence for that. I don't have like documented proof that I ate lunch earlier today, but I know I ate lunch earlier today. So there are many things we take for granted every day that we just believe without having to provide this kind of evidence, this empirical evidence. And Plantinga really wanted to put a Christian bent on this and challenge this and say we're playing into the atheist's hand when we continually try to provide evidence for our Christian beliefs. I'm going to insist that we don't need proof for the existence of God, and that the insisting that we need to provide proof is actually irrational. So what he would say is that belief in God is properly basic, like the belief I exist. If you've ever taken like an introductory philosophy course, you probably talk about, you'll do silly little exercises like, how do you know you exist? Or, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it really make a sound? How do you know? See, those types of questions are built on this false presupposition that you need to provide evidence for every belief that's out there. Well, of course the tree makes sound. Why would any rational person say it doesn't? What special circumstances happen to where you would say, oh no, it didn't make a sound? Like, is sound contingent upon our presence being there? No, it's ridiculous. There are many things that we believe about everyday life that do not require evidence. And Plantinga and his circle of philosophers around him were really playing hard into this. And so they would say that belief in God innately occurs in all humans. And they got this idea from John Calvin, who got this idea from Paul. We talked about this last week, where we talked about Romans 1, where the evidence for God is out there. It is clearly perceived, and it is it's implanted in humans, but it is suppressed through sinful rebellion. So Plantinga would also go on to say that God is wholly different. Therefore, to prove God through empirical or rational evidence is irrational. So what he means is that God is something, yes, he shares attributes with us and we are like him to a certain extent, but he is something that is so wholly other. He is something that is so beyond our full comprehension that to try to give evidence that he exists is irrational. And so those are kind of the main tenets of his argument, is that belief in God is properly basic, belief in God is innately implanted in us, and that trying to prove God through evidence is irrational. That's Reformed epistemology. And so we continue on this. Proponents of this, Alvin Plantinga, Ronald Nash. I love Ron Nash. He's my dude. So if you want a good apologist, that's who I say you go to. And then John Calvin. John Calvin never came up with Reformed epistemology, but they took Calvin's theology. They took Calvin's knowledge, this section of knowledge right in the very beginning of the Christian Institutes, and they took that information and they said, we're going to build a philosophy around what John Calvin is saying, because we believe he represents the biblical way of how humans come to knowledge of God and themselves. Strengths. This has been a powerful, 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 theory in academia. It has been difficult to overcome. We're talking about this hit in the late 60s, early 70s. Philosophers are still trying to debunk Plantinga. They can't. They haven't been able to do it yet. They're still wrestling with it. And then Plantinga has kind of stood on top. He's like kind of playing like king of the mountain, and he's just kind of stood up there on the top of the philosophical mountain, and everybody's they're trying to tackle him, and he just keeps knocking them down. He's been awesome. And there is not an apologist today that has not read what Plantinga wrote. Everybody has read Plantinga. Everybody has been influenced by him. And we're talking about high-level philosophers. And I'll get to this in a minute, but laity like you and me, it's difficult to understand, but powerful in academia, difficult to overcome, influential on numerous contemporary apologists. We talked about William Lane Craig earlier. I believe I've heard him say that the most influential thing in his studies, as a graduate student and into doctoral studies, the thing that really gave him confidence in his beliefs was reading Plantinga and listening to Plantinga's arguments. And it's a great defensive position. It doesn't go on the offense a lot, but it really, really questions the presuppositions that the evidentialist brings to the table in his arguments against belief in God. Now, and then it's used across the apologetic spectrum. What I mean by that is that different apologists from different approaches will often use Reformed epistemology to their advantage. Even the evidentialist may use it at some point to say that, well, I don't necessarily have to provide evidence for my belief, but here's some anyways. I actually just read a book over winter break while I was out of school on different Christian epistemologies, and Reformed epistemology was one of them. And there were 5 different views represented in this book, and 4 out of the 5 had huge praise for Reformed epistemology. They used it. They had some concerns about it, but they used it. They thought it was a great breakthrough. This is very influential, very powerful in the high level scholarship. The only problem, a huge problem, its weakness, it's not easily understood or accessible by the masses. You've probably never heard of Reformed epistemology before. And if you have, you may not understand it. Most people that I know who know anything about apologetics have never heard of Reformed epistemology. And I've told people in the past, I've said, if I could write a book where I could make Reformed epistemology understandable and usable for the laity, I'd probably never have to work again, because that book would just sell like crazy. It's just not out there. It's difficult to understand. There's no one who's put it into a simple, usable form for the laity to go out and use it in their apologetic approaches. So those were the weaknesses of that. Any questions? That was a longer section. Any questions about Reformed epistemology before I move on?
So are you recommending something by Nash, or?
Okay, yeah. Nash's book, Faith and Reason.
Yeah.
This is Searching for a Rational Faith. This is still used in textbooks today, talking about apologetics. Nash is dead. He's been dead for about 15 years. He taught at Reformed Theological Seminary, and then he taught at Southern down in Louisville, who if you talk to any of the guys at church that are really into theologians, they're probably interested in a lot of guys down at Southern, because Sacred Mission has a lot of commonality with the theology that goes on at Southern. Nash is pretty much responsible for developing the philosophy and apologetics programs at Southern Seminary. And in fact, when I was looking at doctoral entrance exams and what would need to be known in order to get into like a PhD program at Southern in like philosophy or apologetics, half of the books that you need to know all the arguments for and be able to talk about them in an oral exam, half of them are Ronald Nash's books. That he is so influential on Reformed Baptist apologetics that it's just really, there's no one else that shines quite like he does. Now there are other guys in like Presbyterian circles that believe kind of like what he believes, but not exactly the same. We'll actually talk about that in a minute. But Nash, you can't go wrong with Faith and Reason. He also, if you buy this book, there is also a podcast out there from Reformed Theological Seminary, and it's dated. It goes back to when RTS was actually sending out. They were doing distance courses and they were sending out cassette tapes, and so these recordings are all made on cassette tapes in like 1992. So it's dated by many years. But if you buy the book, his class pretty much follows the book. That if there's something you can't understand or you're having trouble with, his class goes right along with the book and really makes sense of a lot of stuff. It's not the most approachable book, but it's definitely a good in the ballpark book that if you really wanted something to take a deeper dive into apologetics, his book it's right up there. I love it. I use it almost every semester for papers that I'm writing. So any other questions? All right. So presuppositionalism. Now, if you've been hanging around Sacred Mission for a while and you've talked about apologetics, you've probably heard of presuppositionalism. This is typically the approach that Calvinists would use. Not always. Again, R.C. Sproul, Calvinist, using the classical approach. But this is where, I mean, this is a heavy Presbyterian approach, and they're all mostly Calvinists. And then, a lot of Reformed Baptists who are Calvinists use this approach, like Ronald Nash that I just mentioned. But there are many variations of presuppositionalism. We won't get into all of those, but presuppositionalism is a method that states Christian faith is the only basis for rational thought. It attempts to show flaws in opposing worldviews and denies any neutral assumptions that allow the non-Christian to reason to God. There's a lot there. Let me explain it. And this is what part of the reason why it's not popular is, or it's not as popular as it could be, is that it's difficult to understand. Now, it's a method that states the Christian faith is the only basis for rational thought. We could have questions about, well, what about general revelation? There are people who do math who aren't Christians. And yeah, we would lump general revelation into that. We would lump people's ability to do arithmetic into that, because God, who God is and what he is and his attributes, logic is not just something that's off out in the universe and God hangs on to as something that he gives to us as a present or something. No, logic comes from God. Logic is who God is. It's part of him. And so when we say that, Christian faith is the only rational basis for thought, or the only basis for rational thought, part of that is that, having this kind of dependence and this thought about God, that is the only basis for rational thought. We can only think rationally because God has revealed himself to us in some way, whether it be general revelation or special revelation. So that's a little difficult to understand. And what I don't want to fall into is that Christians are the only people who think rationally. That's not what I'm saying here. All right. There are certain limitations to the non-Christian's ability to think rationally. But again, the non-Christian can do math, he can do formal logic. There are plenty of non-Christians who are programming our computers and everything we see out there and on the web. There's an ability to think logically, and logic is part of who God is, and it's part of how he reveals himself to us in his general revelation. All right. But I don't want to get into the problem. I don't want to get into the fault of saying, no, you have to be a Bible believing Christian to think any kind of rational thought. That's just simply not true. All right. So, but what we would say is that the Christian faith, as far as knowing God, knowing who God is, and knowing him in a salvific way, is the only basis for rational thought salvifically, for sure. So there's a lot there. I'm going to continue to unpack it. So a method that states Christian faith is the only basis for rational thought. It attempts to show flaws in opposing worldviews and denies any neutral assumptions. I talked about that earlier. We talked about it in evidentialism, where it kind of assumes a neutrality of the unbeliever, that the unbeliever can just look at historical facts objectively and then make a decision for God based on that. This approach says, nah, humans are non-believers are sinful. Humans are in rebellion against God. We do not approach these issues neutrally. We approach them biased. We approach them in rebellion against God. And so what they do then is, instead of providing evidence, what these presuppositionalists will do, instead of providing evidence for their beliefs, what they will often do is attack the biased worldview of the non-believer. And so that's really the approach of presuppositionalism, a method that states really salvific faith is only, its only basis is, Christian salvific faith is the only basis for rational thought. We can only know God in a salvific way through Christianity, which I don't think anybody here is going to disagree with, but God does reveal himself generally. That doesn't erase all rational thought. It's just how we rationally know God salvifically. And it attempts to show flaws in the opposing worldview by saying that nobody comes to the table neutrally. Everybody comes with presuppositions. Everybody comes with things that they presuppose before they get into conversations, and they have biases before they get into conversation. And we attempt to undermine or to overturn those biases through dialogue, through conversation. And we try to take away those roadblocks that are not allowing people to believe in God. So it's a very different approach than evidentialism. So proponents of this, you may have heard of some of these guys before. Cornelius Van Til, he's kind of seen as the godfather of presuppositionalism. John Frame, he's a great Presbyterian theologian. Gordon Clark, he was a contemporary of Van Til, believed some different things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Believed some different things from Van Til. Ronald Nash was a student of Gordon Clark. Carl Henry, and guys, if you don't know who Carl Henry is, you need to look him up. He's amazing. He's maybe the most important evangelical theologian of the 20th century. Just going to throw that out there. We can talk about reasons why later, but I want to keep moving on. Carl Henry was a student of Gordon Clark. And then Francis Schaeffer. Again, if you don't know who Francis Schaeffer is, you need to buy some of his books. Great, just writer. Just makes you think, turns things upside down. Now, there's a lot of names there. There's kind of a split between how these presuppositionalists will think. Van Til and Frame, they go a much more faith-based route, where they have a high distrust of reason, to the point where some people would call them fideists, that they believe we can only know things about God through faith alone. Now, I don't think that's true of John Frame, but reading Cornelius Van Til, one might assume that. Um, that's definitely the criticism he gets from other people on this list, like Gordon Clark, Ron Nash, and Carl Henry. Gordon Clark developed another form of presuppositionalism where he said that, we can use these rational arguments and these, natural theology. We just have to make sure it's in the right lane, that it's being corralled correctly. Otherwise, it'll run amok. And but Gordon Clark and Ron Nash and Carl Henry, they were still all about attacking the unbelievers' presuppositions. They did not believe people come to, any kind of faith conversation neutrally. Everybody is biased. They all believed that we don't need to provide evidence for exactly, every belief that we have. We need to challenge the evidentialist assumption. So those are the proponents there. Just know that if you go on to read any of these guys, there is a divide between some of those guys in presuppositionalism. Some strengths: high view of Scripture and God's sovereignty. Very, very high view of Scripture. These guys are more than likely going to be theologians first and philosophers second, where, people in the other approaches, sometimes they are philosophers first and then theologians. I know that Frame and Henry and Schaeffer and Van Til, they were all theologians first and then philosophers. Very, very high view of Scripture, very particular about their exegesis and how they really look at the Scriptures and how they, how they take them apart and how they identify different parts of them. Very meticulous about that. You don't see that kind of precision or care, with some of the other approaches. And so that's a huge strength of presuppositionalism. There's a strong sense of worldview, defensive apologetic. What I mean by that is everybody has a worldview. You have a worldview. I have a worldview. If you took my other class last year, we talked about worldviews. Worldviews are built primarily on 5 different beliefs. You've got your theology, what you believe about God; your metaphysics, what you believe about reality. How is this all built together? How does it all come together? Your epistemology, what we just talked about. How do we know what we know? Your anthropology, what is the nature of man? What are we built of? Where do we come from? How do we get here? Where are we going? And then your, I can't remember the 5th one off the top of my head. I'll think of it 2 minutes from now, and I'm sure I'll get that. Oh, your ethics. What do you believe is morally right or wrong? Those are things that build those are 5 common things that you probably you may not know those philosophical names, but I know you have probably thought about all those different 5 categories at one time or another. This approach has a strong sense of getting into the other person's worldview. And if you can really embrace this kind of worldview thinking, it makes having these kind of conversations so much easier, because you can kind of think, oh, he thinks of this about God. His theology is a little off compared to mine. It's different this way. I bet he thinks different. He has different ethical beliefs based on his theology. I'm going to ask him a question about his moral beliefs and what he thinks is moral versus immoral. And so if you understand worldview and how to, kind of probe it and ask questions about it, it's a really powerful tool. And it can be used as a defensive apologetic, where if someone lobs an attack at Christianity, you can really use that worldview approach to ask questions about why they are attacking your beliefs in such a way. And so that's a huge strength. And then some presuppositionalists, not all, some presuppositionalists use classical arguments. I just told you about Ron Nash, and I think he's great. He views, and this is my view as well, his view about the classical arguments, the proofs for the existence of God. He doesn't believe they're coercive. He doesn't believe that they force the non-Christian to believe in God. What he says is they're like tools. They give people intellectual kind of consent, or it gives them intellectual permission to look at belief in God, and you can use them as tools. And if one argument doesn't work, try another. And if that one doesn't work, try another, and just kind of go on in that way. Use them, but understand that they are very limited in their abilities to bring the non-believer to any kind of faith or belief in God. So those are its strengths: high view of scripture, strong sense of worldview, and then some of them use classical arguments. And then the weaknesses of this, presuppositionalism may be well known in our circle, but it's not really well known in a wide evangelical circle. I tell people all the time, and this kind of, predominantly in reform circles, and it goes into my next few points. It's a weak offensive strategy, and it's has questionable missional impact. Funny story, I've taught apologetics at another church before that had a very presuppositionalist approach. They loved Cornelius Van Til, and I used John Frame's book to teach about apologetics, because I knew if I used John Frame's book, they would be cool with that. You know, John Frame's a lot like Cornelius Van Til. And one of the pastors comes up to me and he's like, I'm kind of surprised you used John Frame's book. I know you're not all in on John Frame. And I said, yeah, you know, I know that I used it because I know that you guys would agree with it and you'd like it. But I'll be honest, I've never heard anybody say they came to faith in Jesus Christ by reading an apologetics book by Cornelius Van Til or John Frame or any of these presuppositionalists. But I hear massive amount of people that will say things like, yeah, I came to believe in Christ when I heard William Lane Craig deliver his, arguments for the existence of God. And it's just like, okay, what's going on here? There's a different kind of missional impact happening in other camps, happening in other approaches of apologetics that is not necessarily happening in presuppositionalism. So that's my weakness for it. Take it or leave it. You may be offended by that. I don't know, but that's what I see. Are there any questions about presuppositionalism? I said a lot there.
Yeah, I'd love, if you have time, I'd like to dialogue a little bit about this. Is that okay? Or
sure, we got time.
Go back one slide.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking in my brain, just so you have the backdrop. Oh.
Where are we? Here we go.
There you go. So I'm thinking about Jeff Durbin.
Okay. I don't know who that is.
Okay, some dude, and his thing is, I'm going to engage the abortionist. I'm going to engage the I don't know, pick whatever your hot social issue is, and I'm going to use presuppositionalism to show the absurdity of their thinking in the absence. They have nothing to stand on. If you deny God, how do you have the right to complain? There is no absolute truth in your worldview. And he does a really good job. And so I'm just kind of looking at this sentence: attempts to show flaws in opposing worldviews. I'm just trying to understand that sentence more completely. And denies any neutral assumptions that allow the non-Christian to reason to God. Am I thinking right? Because as I watch him use it, what he does is he denies neutral assumptions and tears down those things he leads them in the world of absurdity.
I think
absurd. And that,
I think you're on the right, you're definitely on the right track there, Rick. That is the goal, that it is you're tearing down the other worldview to show its irrationality and its logical fallacies.
Okay. Yeah, I was liking what you said at the very end there, because as I watched him so many times, I told this to Drew Fitzgerald many times, I don't know how effective of a witnessing tool that is in and of itself, but in terms of tearing the legs out from under someone, wow. And then for me, it's like, oh, now someone else could come in with a better apologetic to now. It was like he was deconstructing, right?
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
it
and
was really good. So does that fit with what you're trying to teach
yeah,
us?
and so I think the main, yeah, absolutely. And I've used that same advice with a friend that I've watched online have debates about, issues like abortion with people. And he gets into all these social media debates. And I've told him, hey, why don't you ask a question instead of like trying to provide all these arguments and
Right.
evidence for your position? Why don't you try asking a question why this person believes what they believe, and digging more into that? And again, I think the main divide. So you have these hardline presuppositionalists on one side with Cornelius Van Til. I'd say John Frame is kind of in the middle, even though he was a student of Van Til. And then you've got these other guys on the other side, like Gordon Clark, Ronald Nash, Carl Henry, Francis Schaeffer, where they will use arguments. Van Til takes a lot of heat because he's kind of seen as only tearing the legs out underneath people and attacking that way without offering anything else to drive the conversation forward. But his theological conviction was that we can't use any kind of proofs to point to people towards God. They don't work that way. The only way that proofs work is if a person is already a Christian, and then we can understand our natural theology that way. Whereas guys on the other side will say, yeah, we get what you're saying, Van Til. We don't believe that proofs cause people to believe in God either, but we think that there's something there where if we offer these good arguments, they give non-believers some kind of intellectual permission to pursue these questions even more. Does that make sense?
It does to me. And again, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, and this is why we have to, it's not a perfect or right analogy, but a parallel would almost be, you have to teach about the wrath of God before you can talk about the grace of God. Say I have to undermine your stability in all the things that you've built up in your mind, and then introduce God's truth to that, to say, see, this answers your questions, not the things that you were grasping at it. I'm making that up in my mind as I go here, but that's how I piece it together.
No, well, actually, Francis Schaeffer says that exact thing in his book, Death in the City. It's a great little book. It's like 100 pages, but he talks about we can't talk about the good news of God until we properly understand the wrath of God. Mm-hmm. And so it's different approaches. And like I've said the entire class, and I want to make this abundantly clear, the church has always disagreed about how to approach this topic. I have convictions about how we should do apologetics. They may be wrong. That's okay. You may have different convictions, and they could be wrong or they could be right. That's okay. We're trying to figure this out together. We're trying to use these different tools so that we can take the gospel out to our neighbors. And that's really the goal here. So, yeah, undermining a worldview, taking the legs out, and then offering something positive on top of that has been my approach. I'm hoping it can be your approach too. So we've got two more real quick here, and these will go much faster. We have the experiential approach. And this is a method that does not rely on logical arguments at all, or believe Christian truth must be presupposed. All right. So that some of them would even go so far to say is that Christian faith is not rational. It's in fact irrational. It's subjective to every person, but it believes that truth must be experienced rather than something that is gained through knowledge. Typically, when we talk about truth in a biblical perspective, there's kind of two ways to think of it. There's kind of two ways that theologians have seen it and kind of married them together. We have this kind of intellectual assent, this logical reasoning part of truth, but we also have this experience part of it that is very real, and we have to experience truth as well. And And theologians have classically always kind of brought those two together and put them in harmony. Whereas the experiential approach kind of just says, no, we don't need that logical part. We're just or that reasonable part. We're just going to get rid of it. And we just think that truth must be experienced completely. Now, that's the extreme view on here. Not everyone who uses an experiential approach believes that to its fullest extent. And I'll show you here in a minute. Um, Proponents of this view, I got some weird names here. Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, pretty popular. He's known as like kind of the father of modern existentialism and philosophy, the philosophy of existence and experience. And Friedrich Schleiermacher. If you don't know Schleiermacher's tale, if you don't know his story, you probably should. Schleiermacher is considered the father of modern liberal theology. If you look through the history of theology and you read about the major figures and who had great influence, Schleiermacher had a great influence, but everything was downhill after him. He did so much damage to Christian theology and really removing any kind of revealed truth from the Christian experience. He totally divorced them. And that was a huge problem. And it's still a problem today that we're dealing with because we have so many churches today that are still stuck in this experience God mode. And that's how we know God. We don't know him. They act like we don't know God through any kind of knowledge, through any kind of intellectual assent. It's all through experiencing God. The ghost of Schleiermacher is still haunting churches today, and it's awful. But why I say that, if you don't know Schleiermacher's tale, and this is an anecdote, a warning for all you parents out there. Schleiermacher grew up in a Christian home. His father was either a Lutheran pastor or chaplain, I can't remember, and his grandfather was the same. And so it grew up in a home that should know how to catechize people, how to train young people up in the faith. Schleiermacher was sent away to a private school ran by the Moravians, a sect of Christianity that's very much all about. Is it Moravian or maybe it's Moravian? I can't remember. I'll remember that later. I can't remember the exact name, but they were very they were all about experiencing and feeling, and they didn't have the intellectual theological tools to answer the questions that Schleiermacher had as he was growing up. And so really, even though Schleiermacher was coming up with all this Christian theology, by the time he was a man who was teaching at the university level, he was really a practical atheist, just writing Christian theology and doing all kinds of damage to the church. And a lot of people have pointed to his time growing up in this school where they didn't have the tools to answer his questions, where they didn't have these kinds of intellectual answers for the problems he was having. And his father, who wouldn't answer these questions either, really resulted in one of the most damaging theologians of our time. Well, not of our time, of history. And so that's an anecdote for all you parents out there. Train your children in righteousness. Teach them the Bible. Answer their questions. Take this stuff seriously because you never know what could happen. So again, the experience, I took a rabbit trail there, but this is a method that does not rely on logical arguments or believe Christian truth must be presupposed. It believes that truth must be experienced. Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Schleiermacher are the proponents of it. Now, there are also partial proponents. And when I say partial, I mean that they will use this approach to a certain extent. And that's Francis Schaeffer, C.S. Lewis, Ronald Nash, all apologists that I have a high amount of respect for. When they use the experiential approach, what they're pretty much doing is saying that a life lived outside of Christian faith is pretty much unlivable. All right. And that if you were to experience the Christian faith, you would know what we're talking about. So that's kind of the approach they'll use from Christian experience there. And so they are partial proponents. They're not full proponents. They didn't believe that Christian truth must be experienced completely. All right. But they did give a lot of respect to experience. Some strengths. It meets people where they are. And that's very true. I mean, there's something to be said about all these churches that are like, come experience this, people are looking for something, and it's not a bad thing to have this kind of experience when you go into a church setting. But if that's the extent of what you know about God, it could be very dangerous. Weaknesses, theologically questionable. I just told you the unfortunate story of Schleiermacher and how much damage he did to the Christian church, to academic theology, and the effect that he has had on the church for well over 300 years. I mean, it's bad. And so it's very questionable, very theologically questionable. If you're going to use the experiential approach, if you're going to talk about how truth needs to be experienced, it should always be done with other approaches. This should not be the main approach you're using all the time. You can't anchor your apologetic approach just in experience. You have to use it as another tool, like we talked about with presuppositionalism, how they can use different arguments for God's existence. This is simply another tool to be used in your apologetic approach. Oh, and can be logically contradictory. Yeah, so sorry, I forgot about this one. It can be logically contradictory. Soren Kierkegaard was known for this. He thought that faith was completely subjective, that everything we know about God was through our own subjective experiences, and that we would need to really question the objective dogmatic doctrines of the Christian church. And he just ran into all kinds of logical contradictions with that. I mean, he kind of looked silly doing that because he would contradict himself and then he would go back and forth. And it was really kind of silly. So again, weaknesses, it's theologically questionable. It can be logically contradictory. And then the last approach, I want to get through this one real quick, and then we will talk about, we'll open it up for questions or conversations. Fideism, it's the complete denial of any apologetic method. It attempts to protect Christian faith by intellectual isolation, typically accompanies a complete denial of general revelation. So what this means, have you ever known a church that's kind of a holy huddle? They don't talk to anyone outside of the church. They don't really get into any kind of mission. They're just all about preserving their church and their brand of faith. This is fideism, right? They don't believe in using any kind of rational approach to reaching out to people and sharing their faith. They really isolate themselves intellectually. And we see this somewhat with like the evolution debate that is still going on, within, the Christian culture today. It's really a subculture kind of thing where they say, well, we don't need to worry about that. We're just going to teach creationism and that's it. And it's like, well, no, don't do that, because then when your kids go to encounter people in the world, they're not going to know what they're talking about, and they'll look silly. So it generally denies general revelation. It just says that God doesn't reveal himself to humanity through his creation. God only reveals himself to us through the Bible. So these are your hard, and let me be very clear. Sacred mission is very good at being biblically faithful, being all about honoring the scriptures and holding it up as the highest authority. But I would never say that Sacred Mission is a church that is Bible thumpers that say God only reveals himself through the scriptures. We can't know anything else outside of about God from his outside creation or anything like that. It's only through the Bible. And I don't see that. I don't think it's a biblical position. I think the Bible is very clear. We talked about last week. God reveals himself generally, not salvifically, but generally through his creation. Some proponents of this, we talked about this last week. Karl Barth, he was a huge proponent of this. We talked about how he nixed general revelation altogether, and that the only revelation that we could have was in the person Jesus Christ. Soren Kierkegaard, we just talked about him, how he was all about experience. And again, he denied any kind of general revelation, any kind of natural theology, any kind of objective approach to knowledge of God outside of human subjective experience. And so we would put Soren Kierkegaard in the Fideism camp as well, even though he was all about experience. These two kind of overlap somewhat. And then I got a question next to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I know that some of you are probably huge fans of Bonhoeffer. He's great. Don't get me wrong. He wrote some good things, but there's definitely, if you read some of his less popular works, like his book on ethics, for example, he definitely sounds like a fideist when you read it. And he was actually accused of being a fideist by Karl Barth towards the end of Dietrich's life. He was accused of being a fideist by none other than Karl Barth, a fideist himself. But I put a question mark there. I don't know for sure, but there's definitely some questions about him. I just actually read a book recently where the theologian he was a great theologian. His name's John Webster. He died about 20 years ago, but he definitely laid out some things where he said, well, we kind of see this fideism practice in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Doesn't discount the great things he did. Wrote a great book called Discipleship that I'm sure a lot of you have read and think is great. Wrote a great book called was it Living Together or Doing Life Together or something like that. It's been hugely influential, but there were some other things that he wrote that people kind of like, well, we don't think that Dietrich Bonhoeffer really liked apologetics much at all. And he didn't. So that's just a reality we have to live with. Some strengths, I would say none. It contradicts scripture and is false. When you completely deny general revelation, I think you've got a problem. I don't think it lines up with the Bible. I don't think it lines up with what has been classically taught throughout the church, throughout church history. Weaknesses, denies general revelation and is biblically false. That's all I can say about it. It's just that's a huge problem. You can't deny that. It is general revelation is there. We know that God reveals himself. Whether or not we can reach out and comprehend that revelation, that's a different question. That's a question for natural theology. But we know God reveals himself in his creation. And so those are the approaches. That's the end of the presentation tonight, guys. Do we have any questions?
Can you go back to experientialism?
Yeah. Yes.
So as I'm thinking about Francis Schaeffer, and in particular, the series "How Shall We Then Live?" Be quiet. Sorry, Siri just took over. As I think about that, he uses history, culture, arts. He shows all these things as part of his. Here's the end result of your worldview that doesn't have legs to stand on, right?
Yeah.
So is that the same thing as what you're saying here, or is that a good application of experientialism?
What I would say is that I see Schaeffer a lot of times say that, and let me be clear, this is an approach that can be used by other approaches.
Okay.
And so if it stands on its own, I think it's problematic. But if it's used by other approaches, it can be very, very beneficial. I see Schaeffer being very almost existential in his approach sometimes, where he says, guys, life without being a Christian is simply unlivable. You can't live a logically coherent life outside of being a Christian. You can't experience a good life outside of being a Christian. And I think he tries to drive some of that experience into his presuppositional approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. That was always one of the things I really enjoyed about listening, reading, and watching his stuff was just seeing how a thought had implications in art, had in architecture, in just how culture, society was run and all that. And I kind of enjoyed seeing, oh, I can see why that looks this way now. It reflects what was going on in philosophy at the time and that kind of. So I kind of like that, but I hear what you're saying.
He's wonderful. Again, if you guys haven't read him, how then shall we live? Is that what it is? That's his main book. And then I mentioned Death in the City. That's not really an apologetic book, but he's got some great stuff out there, and a lot of it is very approachable.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. Other questions? I'll leave it open just for a minute. I know I'm not this good. You guys have got to have some questions. I see Ben smiling there. No. All right.
I really tried, Ben. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I understand. We have a smaller group tonight too. Usually Rick or what's his name? Martin. He'll ask a question. Was it Rick Martin? I think I can't.
Rick Martini.
Yeah, Rick Martini. Yeah, he'll usually ask a question or two, and then we're missing David. David always asks a few questions, so it's not a big deal. All right, guys. Well, hey, thanks so much. We'll have this posted on the thread soon. I don't know, tonight or tomorrow morning. And keep reading. And if you guys have questions about the reading, write them down. Bring them to here. We'll talk about them. So, but keep reading, praying for you. Hopefully this isn't too much, and we'll just keep moving through this. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. See you, folks.